The Wedgwood dessert plate exploded against the herringbone floor before anyone in the dining room of Harrington House quite understood what had happened. Dark chocolate ganache asked across the white oak in a wide, ugly crescent, and for one frozen second the entire table, 12 of the most powerful and dangerous people in Ontario, stared at the mess in complete silence. Then Cordelia Ashford started screaming. "She attacked him!" Cordelia's voice hit a register that rattled the crystal in the chandelier above. Her slender finger shot out like an accusation made physical, aimed directly at Fern Cassidy's face. I watched her. She knocked it out of the server's hands on purpose. This woman just tried to kill Ciro. She looked around the room, her voice dropping into something colder, more deliberate. "Someone remove her. Do you have any idea how much this gown costs? She had no business being in this room. Look at her. The jacket doesn't even close. You let someone like this near his food." Within seconds, 2 of Ciro Vantini's guards had their hands on Fern. Fern didn't fight it. She was 26 years old, 5'4", and built the way she'd been built her whole life. Solidly, substantially, in a way that made airline armrests a personal inconvenience and formal uniforms a negotiation. She was wearing the black catering jacket, 2 sizes too small, that the event coordinator, a brittle woman named Helena, had shoved at her that morning with a look that made clear it was all they had. The buttons were doing their level best. She had been working catering events across the Greater Toronto area for 3 years. She was invisible in the way that service staff are always invisible to the people being served. Background furniture, part of the decor, noticed only when something went wrong. Something had gone very wrong. "Please," she said, and her voice came out smaller than she wanted. "Please, you have to listen to me. There's something wrong with the ganache. He can't eat it." "Get her out," said the man closest to Ciro Vantini's chair. That was Aldo Ferris, head of personal security, a former military contractor with a jaw like a cinder block and eyes that registered everything. He didn't look at Fern the way Cordelia did, with contempt. He looked at her the way you looked at a variable you hadn't yet solved for. But the order stood. Now. They took her through the service corridor, down 2 flights of stairs, and locked her in the wine cellar. It wasn't dramatic the way cellars in movies are dramatic. It was a climate-controlled room with fluorescent tube lighting, wire racks of Riesling, and a floor drain that smelled faintly of something that had died in the pipes. There was a metal folding chair in the corner. She sat in it and pressed the heels of her hands against her eyes and tried to think. The event was a private dinner, officially a fundraiser for a hospital expansion in Etobicoke. Unofficially a gathering of the specific kind of men who moved serious money through southern Ontario and didn't like to be in the same room too often. Ciro Vantini was the reason those men came. He was 51, lean and dark, with the kind of stillness that predators have. The stillness of something that doesn't need to telegraph its intentions, because it has never once been the prey. He controlled the shipping infrastructure along the north shore of Lake Ontario, which was a polite way of saying he controlled what moved through those ports and what didn't. And everyone in a radius of several hundred kilometers understood what that meant. He had a documented, life-threatening allergy to tree nuts, specifically almonds. His team communicated this to every venue, every caterer, every private chef, before every event he attended. It was a known fact. His medical file, his event coordinator's pre-arrival checklist, the laminated placard in the Harrington House kitchen that had been there since the venue was first used 4 years ago. It was all on record. Cordelia Ashford had been with him for 8 months. She was 34, a former features editor at a Toronto lifestyle magazine, now a woman who attended things. She was the kind of beautiful that got used as a standard of comparison, fine-boned and fair, with the particular sharpness of someone who had decided, somewhere in their early 20s, that being liked was less useful than being feared. She had looked at Fern exactly once that evening, during setup, and said, without breaking her conversation with a woman in emeralds, "Tell them to keep the kitchen staff out of the dining room until after the cocktail hour. I don't want the ambiance disturbed." Fern had been standing 3 feet away, carrying a tray. She was used to it. What Fern Cassidy was not invisible about, what she had never in her life been invisible about, was food, specifically what was in it. Her younger brother, Danny, had a tree nut allergy so severe that the family kept 3 EpiPens in the kitchen junk drawer, the way other families kept batteries. Fern had learned to cook around it before she was 10 years old. She could identify almond extract by smell, the way a musician identifies a note, instinctively, immediately, without having to think about it. She could taste the difference between hazelnut and walnut in a compound butter. She had, twice in Danny's life, stopped him from eating something that would have killed him before the dish ever reached the table. That evening, she had been assigned to the pastry station for plating. The executive chef was a man named Gus, who ran a clean, orderly kitchen, and had left her to handle the garnishing on 12 identical portions of flourless dark chocolate cake with ganache. The ganache had been prepared hours earlier and kept at temperature. Her job was to spoon it over each slice, add a gold-flecked chocolate disc on top, and send the plates out. She had dipped the spoon into the ganache bowl, lifted it to check the consistency, and the smell had hit her the way it always did, sudden and specific, like a key turning in a lock. Underneath the bitter chocolate and heavy cream, something else, sweet, synthetic, the unmistakable chemical floral note of almond extract. She had stood there for 1 full second before she understood what she was about to do, and then she had walked out of the kitchen and through the service door into the dining room, which she absolutely was not supposed to do, and she had reached the table right as the server was setting the first plate down in front of Ciro Vantini. She had grabbed the plate off the table. She had meant to set it down safely. She had meant to say, calmly, "There is a problem with this dish." But the server had grabbed at her arm, startled, and the plate had gone sideways and hit the floor, and then Cordelia Ashford had started screaming, and here Fern was, in the wine cellar, alone. She pressed the heels of her hands harder against her eyes and thought about Danny, about the way his throat had closed the second time, when he was 14, and the blue cast his lips had gone. She thought about Ciro Vantini sitting at that table with a spoonful of ganache, and she thought, even if no one believes me, I did the right thing. It didn't make the cold concrete floor any less cold. She had no idea how much time passed. Long enough that the fluorescent tube above her began its end-of-life flicker. Long enough that she had walked the perimeter of the room 3 times cataloguing wine labels because it was something to do. She was not going to cry. She was going to be absolutely, stubbornly fine. The lock disengaged with a sound like a gunshot. She pressed back against the wire rack behind her, which was less an act of self-defense and more an act of someone who had just had every nerve-ending fire at once. Ciro Vantini stepped into the room alone. He pulled the door shut behind him and stood there for a moment, looking at her with an expression she couldn't read. He was still in his dinner jacket. There was a line between his brows that hadn't been there before, and something in his face that looked, for a man of his reputation, remarkably like a person holding themselves accountable. "The ganache," he said, not a question. "Almond extract," Fern said. Her voice came out steadier than she expected. "Someone put almond extract into the ganache. I could smell it when I went to plate. I know what it smells like. My brother has the same allergy you do. I've spent 15 years learning to catch it before it became an emergency." Ciro was quiet. "I know how this looks," she said. "I know what she told you. But I wasn't near that ganache bowl when it was prepared. I came into the kitchen for the 4 o'clock briefing and didn't touch anything in the pastry station until plating started. If you check the security footage—" "We did," Ciro said. Fern stopped. "Aldo pulled it while I was managing the room upstairs." He said it without particular inflection, the way he said most things. "The kitchen camera covers the pastry station. You were not within 2 meters of that bowl between the time it was made and the time you started plating. You were, in fact, on the other side of the kitchen for most of the evening." Fern's knees felt strange. "Someone was in that bowl," Ciro continued. "During the cocktail hour, when the kitchen staff went out to the side terrace for their break, someone entered through the garden access door. The timestamp is 7:42 p.m. The figure is wearing a coat. We're working on the rest." "A coat," Fern said slowly, "at a dinner event." "A coat," Ciro confirmed, "and the specific perfume that Cordelia wears, which was also on the handle of the garden door. Aldo's team is thorough." The silence stretched. Fern thought of Cordelia's face during the accusation, the speed of it, the precision, the way the tears had appeared on schedule, the exact moment she had pivoted to Fern's body as ammunition. It had been a performance. She had recognized it as a performance even in the middle of being dragged away, and hadn't been able to articulate why. Now she could. It was the performance of someone who already knew their lines because they had written the script in advance. "She was going to let you eat it," Fern said. "Yes. And blame me. You were the obvious candidate." Something in his voice shifted, not warm, exactly, but different. Careful, in a way that felt deliberate. "You're the person who touched the plates. You're the person who made a scene. You're someone no one in that room was going to stand up for." A pause. She was precise about it. Fern looked at the floor. She understood what he meant. She had always understood the calculus of her own invisibility, how it worked for her in some rooms and against her in others. In that dining room with those people, she had been the most discardable person at the table. Cordelia had known that, had factored it in. "There's something else," Ciro said. He reached into his breast pocket and held up a small glass vial between 2 fingers. The label had been peeled away, but the residue at the bottom was pale, faintly oily. This was in the kitchen bin, slipped down behind the paper liners, which is why the first pass missed it. Almond extract concentrate, pharmaceutical grade. He looked at her, the kind that can be ordered through a specialty pharmacy, which Cordelia uses for her own supplements. The pieces settled into place with a terrible quietness. "She has an EpiPen in her evening bag," Fern said suddenly. "I saw her put it there during setup. I thought it was hers. I assumed she had an allergy of her own." "She doesn't," Ciro said. "She was prepared to administer it, presumably to appear the hero after." His jaw tightened. It was the first crack in his composure she'd seen. "She would have let me go into anaphylactic shock in front of 100 witnesses, administered the EpiPen herself, and had the kitchen girl arrested for the attempt." Fern couldn't think of a single thing to say to that. He crossed the cellar in 3 strides and crouched down to her eye level in the way that very few men of his height and authority ever bothered to do. His eyes were dark, the particular, watchful dark of someone who has survived by trusting almost nothing and reading everything. Right now he was reading her. "You're not in trouble," he said. "You're not going to be arrested. You're not going to lose your license, or your contract, or your reputation. I'll see to it personally." Fern nodded once. She was absolutely not, going to fall apart in front of this man. "You saved my life," he said quietly, "and you did it knowing exactly what would happen to you if no one believed you. So I want to ask you something honestly. Why?" She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "Because I know what happens when someone has an anaphylactic reaction and no one moves fast enough. I've seen it up close twice with my brother, and I couldn't unsmell what I smelled." She shrugged, once, a small movement. "It wasn't complicated." Something changed in his face. Not visibly, it happened in the eyes, a small recalibration, like a man updating a number he'd been running for a long time. "All right," he said. He stood. "Then let's go back upstairs." She had expected him to go alone. She had expected to be quietly escorted out through the service exit, put in a cab, and that would be the end of it. A story she'd eventually tell Danny. He held the cellar door open and waited. She went through it. They went up the private back staircase, paneled in dark walnut with brass fittings, and came out into a study on the second floor, where Aldo was waiting with 2 other men and a woman in a grey blazer, who looked like a lawyer and almost certainly was. Cordelia was there too, in a wingback chair with her arms crossed and an expression of magnificent sculpted indignation. The indignation flickered when she saw Fern walk in behind Ciro, just for a second. Then it came back harder. "Ciro, you cannot seriously be." "Cordelia." His voice was not raised. It had the quality of a door being closed quietly and finally. "The kitchen access camera shows you entering through the garden door at 7:42. Your perfume is on the handle. The vial is from your pharmacy, and your EpiPen was in your bag tonight, which is notable, given that you have no documented allergies." "That's circumstantial," the man beside Cordelia said quickly. Her brother, Fern, gathered from the resemblance. Sharp, blonde, already calculating exits. "You can't." "I'm not a court," Ciro said pleasantly. "I'm not required to follow rules of evidence." The room went very quiet. "Tell them," Ciro said, turning to Fern, "what you smelled and when and why you know what it was." Fern Cassidy had spent 26 years being told, not in words usually, but in the way people looked past and over and through her, that she didn't matter enough to be believed. She stood in that study, in her too small catering jacket, with the button that had finally given up near the end of the cellar staircase. And she looked at the faces in that room, and she felt something she hadn't anticipated feeling. Not triumph, something quieter, the feeling of a door long stuck, giving way. So she spoke. She talked about Danny and the junk drawer, and 15 years of reading every label on every package before it entered the house. She talked about the ganache, and the moment the spoon came up and she'd caught it, that synthetic sweetness, the note that didn't belong, as clear to her as a wrong chord to someone who has played music their whole life. She talked about it the way she always talked about food, precisely, specifically, without apology. When she finished, the woman in the grey blazer was taking notes. Cordelia was looking at her own hands. "She's fabricating this," Cordelia said, but the certainty had drained out of her voice. What was left was thinner, and everyone in the room could hear the difference. "The vial has your fingerprints on it," Aldo said from the wall. He said it the way you'd mention the weather. The lab confirmed 12 minutes ago. Cordelia's brother stood up and straightened his jacket. "I need to make a phone call," he said, which appeared to be the Ashford family's method of removing themselves from situations they could no longer manage. He walked out without looking at his sister. Cordelia sat very still for a long moment. Then she looked at Fern, really looked at her, possibly for the first time that evening, and her expression was not contempt anymore. It was something rawer than that. It was the specific shock of a person who had planned for every variable and somehow failed to account for the one person they had considered too inconsequential to plan around. "I need my lawyer," she said. "Yes," said the woman in the grey blazer, "you do." She didn't leave through the service exit. Ciro walked her out through the front entrance of Harrington House, and they stood on the stone steps under the portico while an October wind came off Lake Ontario and made nonsense of her hair. "Your jacket," he said, and shrugged off his dinner jacket and held it out. "I'm fine," she said. "You're shivering." She looked down. She was shivering. She took the jacket. It was warm in the way things are warm when they've been worn by someone else, and it hung well past her hips even with her size, which made her feel like a child wearing her father's coat, which was not the impression she was aiming for. She held it shut anyway. "What do you do," Ciro asked, "when you're not saving people's lives at catering events?" She looked at him to see if he was being condescending. He wasn't. He was asking a genuine question, with the focused attention of someone who wanted a real answer. "I'm trying to save enough to do a Red Seal culinary program," she said. "I want to open my own place eventually, something small, a kitchen where everything on the menu is genuinely safe for people with allergies, where it's not just a liability disclaimer, but actually the whole point. Where someone with Danny's allergy could walk in and order anything." She paused. "I know how it sounds." "It sounds specific," he said. "I like specific." She looked out at the driveway, where cars were beginning to gather, as word spread among the guests that the evening was over. "It's going to take time. The program isn't cheap, and I'm still paying off some things from when my mum was sick. It's a long story." "Most worthwhile things are," Ciro said. There was a silence, not uncomfortable, just present. "Your file," he said, "through the catering company. I'd like to have my events coordinator reach out to you directly, not through the agency. I host 12 to 15 private events a year, and apparently my current vetting process has significant gaps." A pause, very dry. "I'd prefer to work with someone I've already tested under pressure." Fern considered that for a moment. "I'd need to know this conversation stays with you. I can't have it getting back to the agency that I caused a scene at a client's dinner. I need those referrals." "It already stays with me," he said. "Everything in that room tonight stays with me." She nodded. He looked at her for a long moment with that same quality of attention, the kind that didn't look past or over or through. "You walked into that dining room knowing no one at that table would take your word over hers. You knew exactly how it would look, and you did it anyway." "I told you," Fern said. "I couldn't unsmell what I smelled." "No," he said, "you couldn't, and you didn't try to." He said it quietly, like something he was still working out. "That is an exceptionally rare thing." He said it without decoration, without performance, the way he said most things, which was precisely why it landed the way it did. Fern looked down at his dinner jacket around her, and then out toward the lake, black and vast in the October dark, and she thought about Danny and the junk drawer, and the long years of being background furniture, and all the rooms she had stood in, where her presence had registered as slightly less than zero. "Thank you," she said, "for coming down to the cellar yourself." "You deserve to hear the truth from me directly," he said, "not through a door." She handed him back his jacket. He draped it over his arm. "I'll have Aldo arrange a car," he said. "Don't argue about it." She didn't. 4 months later, Cordelia Ashford accepted a plea arrangement that kept her out of a public courtroom, but ended, among other things, her ability to enter any property connected to Ciro Vantini's operations or contact anyone within his organization. Her brother issued a statement through the family's public relations firm that contained the phrases "personal matter" and "time of reflection," and nothing else of substance. It was 3 sentences long. Fern enrolled in the Red Seal culinary program in January with a scholarship from a private foundation that her new events contract more than covered. She found out on a Tuesday, sitting at her kitchen table in her apartment in Brampton. And she called Danny first, and he yelled so loud she had to hold the phone at arm's length while he yelled. She worked 9 of Ciro's 12 events that year. By the 3rd, his security team had stopped posting someone at the kitchen door when she was on station. A professional acknowledgement she found more meaningful than most things people said out loud. By the 5th event, Ciro had developed a habit of finding reasons to speak with her directly, in the careful way that very controlled men find reasons to do things they could simply admit to wanting. By the 9th, he stopped finding reasons. He asked her to dinner, not an event, not a function, just dinner, 2 people at a table, on a Wednesday in March, at a small restaurant in Kensington Market that she had mentioned once in passing, months earlier. He had made a reservation. He said her name when he asked. Not Miss Cassidy, not the catering coordinator. Fern, the way you say a name when you've been thinking it for a while. She said yes without hesitating. Later, he would tell her that the moment he had understood who she was, really understood, was not in the dining room when she grabbed the plate, and not in the study when she stood her ground in front of people who ran half of southern Ontario. It was in the wine cellar when she'd looked up at him from that folding chair and said, without self-pity or performance, I couldn't unsmell what smelled. He had spent his adult life surrounded by people who looked the other way as a matter of survival. He hadn't known before Fern that survival could look like something else entirely. She would tell him, eventually, that she had known from the moment he came down those cellar stairs. Not because the situation called for a rescuer, but because he had crouched to her eye level and called her by her name, and every person who had ever treated her like furniture had never once done that. In the spring, she registered her business name with the province of Ontario. Cassidy Kitchen. Small, specific, the kind of place where the people who had always had to call ahead and hope and take the chef's word for it could walk in and order anything on the menu, without hesitation, without the quiet, exhausting fear that had followed Danny his whole life and her right alongside him. Exactly what she'd said it would be.